Xaku is one of the most broken Warframes in the game. Literally, as their theme is that of a broken Warframe. I mean, look at all those pots on their deluxe skin. Before I get into it, I just want to put a small note at the beginning. I recorded this video in multiple sessions before and after the release of Xaku Prime, so if I sound ever so slightly different in some cases, that will be why. In today's video, I will go in depth on Xaku, their abilities, and the most busted builds I have put together. These builds will leisurely take you to level cap, speedrunning relics like no tomorrow, and providing tons of fun, so let's break the pot and show its contents. Xaku recently got his Prime variant released, which you can get from the newly introduced relics. Xaku Prime, compared to base Xaku, has increased stats across the board and has an additional V polarity that will save you one forma on today's builds. As for the builds, all of them will have the same forma configuration, which looks like this. I added one extra V polarity, two extra dash polarities, and I used an aura forma. Besides Xaku Prime, we also got access to the new Quassus Prime and Drumner Prime, but I will cover these in depth in another video as these are quite interesting weapons and will need some deeper explanations. First, let's get into Xaku's abilities, where you will immediately find one of the best Helminth abilities in the game, called Xata's Whisper. Xata's Whisper is Xaku's first ability and is a very intriguing ability that can be used on a large variety of frames, providing a weapon damage boost. This ability also has multiple peculiar interactions with other abilities from other frames, but this could be an entire video on its own, so I will try to keep the ability description for this video as brief as I can. Xata's Whisper deals additional void damage based on a percent of your total weapon damage, which is scaled by ability strength. This additional void damage is a fully separate damage instance and also scales from the modded weapon damage, taking into account base, critical, elemental, and faction damage mods. Moreover, faction damage as well as body part damage multipliers, like headshots, double dip in Xata's damage formula, meaning that they are featured twice in the final damage calculation. This means that if you want to min-max Xata's Whisper damage, you should consider running faction damage mods on all of your weapons and aim for headshots as much as possible. Besides this, mods or arcanes that increase the headshot multiplier, like primary or secondary deadhead, will be twice as effective. Sadly, this ability also has a small anti-synergy within itself, as based on your status chance on your weapon, void damage is able to trigger void bubbles, which work like tiny mag bubbles, redirecting projectiles and turning them into mostly body shots, making it really difficult to land headshots. Okay, so editing Casey here. Even though this is true, there is a little bit more detail in this. It actually depends on where the initial bubble is triggered. If the initial bubble is triggered on a body part, all of the shots will be transformed into body shots. However, if you actually trigger this bubble on a headshot, all of your sequential shots will be headshots as well. However, these bubbles can also be very beneficial as they will redirect enemy fire into them, reducing potential damage that's coming your way, reflecting it to your enemies instead. Xata's additional damage instance is triggered by almost any kind of damage, as it also applies from sources like the mod acid shells on the Sobek and even blast damage status effects, effectively doubling the potential of blast damage. While Xata's Whisper is an incredibly powerful ability, if you build Xaku around their second ability, Xata's will always be the ability that you want to replace with your Helminth ability, as you will see later in the builds that I feature in this video. Which nicely brings me to Xaku's second ability, Grasp of Lohk. Grasp of Lohk is able to disarm and steal weapons from 6 enemy targets in a 15-meter radius, both scaling with ability range, that pop up as void copies alongside Xaku for 12 seconds, which scales with ability duration. The weapons will deal 50 void damage at base, which scales with ability strength. While stealing the weapons does not require line of sight, damaging enemies with the stolen weapons will require line of sight. The void damage this ability deals then scales with the following formula as shown on the Warframe wiki. However, this formula does not show all of the variables that affect the output void damage, because besides the ability strength and the enemy level, this ability also scales with percent damage from Archon Shards, viral procs present on enemies, potential armor present on enemies, damage vulnerability increases from sources like Rest and Rage and Caliban's Sentient Wrath, and the ability damage that for instance Roar can provide. Finally, the void damage vulnerability increase from Xaku's fourth ability will also be able to increase Grasp of Lohk damage. but more on that later. Researching potential min-maxing of this ability also revealed to me that the fire rate of stolen guns is not able to be increased, so the only way to get faster times to kill on enemies is by scaling maximum number of weapons that you can steal through ability range. However, the number of weapons stolen is always rounded down, meaning that let's say your ability range would suggest you can steal 14.9 weapons, you will actually only steal 14. The maximum amount of weapons you can get through modding alone, as of making this video, is 16 weapons at 267% range. But the maximum number of weapons can scale beyond this by things like invigorations or void buffs from opening relics. The Grasp of Lohk ability can be recast up until you reach the maximum number of guns. The damage formula shown earlier, which included the enemy level, will increase the damage based on the level enemies were when you stole their weapons. Because of this, I would highly advise that you let Grasp of Lohk run out on purpose throughout the mission to scale your damage appropriately. It would be massively helpful if instead Grasp of Lohk would just be recastable when enemies have increased their level compared to your stolen weapons. But alas, let's look forward and upward to Xaku's third ability, the Lost. The Lost is an ability that has 3 different sub-abilities called Accuse, Gaze, and Deny. Before I get into what these abilities do, I want to give you a golden tip, which is to go to the Invert Tap Hold abilities in your accessibility settings. I would highly advise swapping this around so you have to hold to switch sub-abilities and tap to cast the sub-abilities. So let's start off with Accuse. Accuse will turn enemies into your best buddies, as they will now fight for you instead of against you, acting a bit like Revenant's Thralls or mind-controlled enemies from Nyx. You can cast this ability at the location of your reticle with an infinite amount of range, after which 8 enemies scaling with ability strength will be converted to fight for you in an 11-meter radius, which scales with ability range. Accused targets can be damaged by your weapons and most Warframe abilities, except for Mace's Peacemakers and your own stolen weapons from Grasp of Lohk. Again, as with the stolen guns from Xaku's second ability, this ability can be recast up until you hit the enemy cap. Accused targets will count towards mission progression and will have to be killed to progress in defense missions and alike. Then for the second sub-ability, Gaze. Gaze is an insane ability for Xaku, as it will provide an instant AoE defense strip. Gaze will freeze an enemy target within 25 meters, scaling with ability range, for 14 seconds, scaling with ability duration, and the target will then become fully immobile and immune to any source of damage, indicated by a grayed out health bar. However, the target is able to receive status effects, so for instance you can use this to proc blast on enemies that are around the target, and damage will be stored and released once you recast the ability on the gaze target. The target will also get a 12-meter radius around them, scaling with ability range, which is the defense strip. On base, 50% of enemy defenses will be lost, which scales with ability strength. And because it's classified as a defense strip, it will strip both enemy armor and enemy shields. Armor will be removed completely when you cast this ability with 200% ability strength or with 164% ability strength if someone in your squad or yourself is running the corrosive projection aura mod. In the odd case that you have an enemy which possesses both shields and armor, for instance an Oxium Osprey, shields will sadly be prioritized over the armor. Luckily, gazed enemies do not count towards mission progression, which means that you do not have to release enemy targets to progress rounds in, for instance, defense missions or other similar game modes. You can use gaze in a combination with Accuse to create an invulnerable decoy, similar to Loki's decoy, that's able to draw fire for as long as Accuse lasts, which can serve as a great survivability tool. A quick quality of life tip is that gazed enemies can be dragged around by the Magus Anomaly Operator Arcane, which can enable you to place these type of decoys wherever you want them. However, the radius and the location of the defense strip will adhere to the location of the initial cast. Furthermore, gaze can be snapshotted, meaning that you can use short buffs to ability strength and ability range, like a void buff, to create a huge defense strip radius for a prolonged amount of time. Then for the final sub-ability of the Lost, which is Deny. This fires a concentrated beam of void energy, and this beam has infinite body punch through. It will reach up to 40 meters, scaling with ability range, and it has 4000 base damage, which scales with the following formula as found on the Warframe wiki. But again, other variables, as I mentioned with the Grasp of Lohk, will apply here too. The most important thing is that this ability will not scale based on the enemy level like Grasp of Lohk did, but instead by the number of Void replicas, or the stolen guns, you have from Grasp of Lohk. While this ability does not scale with enemy level, the base Void damage of 4000 is a massive increase over the 50 base Void damage from Grasp of Lohk, making Deny an insanely powerful beam at lower levels. This covers pretty much all of Xaku's third ability, so now let's look at Xaku's fourth ability, the Fast Untime. This is where Xaku becomes really interesting. The Fast Untime will cause enemies within 25 meters range and within line of sight, scaling with ability range, to take 1200 Void damage, which scales by ability strength. Enemies will also be primed to take 50% more Void damage, which sadly can't be skilled. Furthermore, enemies will be affected by a 25% slow effect, which scales with ability strength for 25 seconds, which scales with ability duration. Xaku will transform themselves into this scrawny little skeleton, but I believe this can be now turned off with a new feature implemented in the latest update. During the Fast Untime, Xaku also gains a 75% chance to dodge incoming enemy attacks, completely avoiding damage, and they get a 20% movement speed increase. Finally, while the Fast Untime is active, Xaku's other abilities will be frozen in time, meaning that from that point onward, the only ability you really have to keep up will be the Fast Untime, saving you a lot of energy and giving you insanely long ability duration on your 1, 2, and 3. The Fast Untime scales well with casting speed, as the animation time of the ability will unpause your other abilities for a very brief moment. So making this animation as short as possible will help you to lose as little time as possible on your other abilities. And yes, I already heard your gears spinning, but sadly the pausing mechanic is not carried over to Helminth abilities, which will still have to be recast. I briefly mentioned the 50% Void damage for an ability that this ability provides before, but let's explain this a bit further. The Void damage for an ability is another way in which you can scale damage for Grasp of Lohk, and this extends even further to Xata's Whisper damage and the Void beam from Deny. As I said, it can't be scaled, but it's a good way to get some extra free damage. So make sure to cast this when you are surrounded by a large number of enemies. The slow effect from the Fast Untime gives you a really solid source of crowd control, which can, funnily enough, be scaled all the way to 100% slow at 400% ability strength. This means you can fully stun lock enemies, and this ability can work great with things that put enemies in stunned animations, like Arcane Eruption. Finally, the Fast Untime possesses some hidden quality of life features. The first one being that this ability will break crates around the map without requiring line of sight, and that the ability range can go up to an insane 70 meters. This can be super helpful if you're farming Syndicate medallions, which will remain on the minimap, compared to all of the other indicators which will disappear after being broken and picked up by the player. The other quality of life feature, which I discovered myself, is that the Fast Untime has a slight amount of forward momentum on cast. This seems negligible at first, but let me tell you, this becomes crazy good when stacked with slam attacks. The reason why this is so good is because you can use Xaku's Forward just before hitting the ground, causing all of your momentum to be transferred into forward momentum, causing you to zip around the map like a madman. So those are all of Xaku's abilities, and to recap... Whoa, hold on there, buddy. Okay, it's editing Casey here once again. I completely forgot about Xaku's augments called Vampiric Grasp for Grasp of Lohk and Relentless Lost for the Lost. So it's not too crazy I looked over both of these because they are very mediocre and don't add too much to Xaku's kit and the builds that I will be featuring, but I will quickly cover them nonetheless. Vampiric Grasp gives you lifesteal on every hit made by your stolen guns, which scales with ability strength, but this only works on enemies affected by your third or fourth ability. For the other augment, the Relentless Lost, this causes you to automatically switch your sub-abilities that then benefit from increased ability strength and efficiency up to 115% and 45% respectively if you do not recast the same ability twice. Okay, so with that said, we can go back into the recap. Xaku's abilities are focused around crowd controlling enemies and dealing massive amounts of void damage. Their, in my opinion, best ability is Grasp of Lohk, which scales with the enemy level and is insanely powerful in long missions, turning you into a mobile sentry gun. Xaku's other abilities synergize nicely to min-max the damage of Grasp of Lohk to make the trip to Levelcap an absolute cakewalk. And the most important thing about Xaku is that they are subscribed to the channel, unlike 95% of the people watching my videos. So take Xaku as an example and subscribe for more Warframe content like this coming your way. Also, while you're down there, please leave me a like, as these videos are not easy to make. With that said, let's get into the build section of the video where I will dive further into all of the synergies you can employ to turn Xaku into an absolute powerhouse. Before I get into the more detailed parts of the build, I want to cover some general things that apply for all builds today, which I will split up into these next sections. I will cover the Archon Shards, the Helminth abilities, the companion considerations, what kind of weapons to use on Xaku, and the optimal arcanes you can choose. For the Archon Shards, I would always recommend running 1 Tau-Forged Ember Shard or 2 normal Ember Shards for additional casting speed as a base. This makes Xaku a lot more fluid to play and will help with min-maxing the ability uptime. Then the other 4 slots are mostly for you to choose, but I would highly advise the following. If you build Xaku for Grasp of Lohk, damage will scale to enemy level, making power strength on shards less needed. As such, I would advise running more duration on your shards so you can benefit from a better energy economy and making it easier to keep up the fast Untime. If at any point you struggle with energy economy, you could consider running Violet Shards for the equilibrium effect without having to use the equilibrium mod on your build. If you feel like your damage needs a little bit more oomph, look for a way to incorporate shards that give ability damage, like the Emerald Shards that give ability damage on enemies that are affected by corrosive effects, Topaz Shards for enemies that are affected by radiation effects, and Violet Shards for enemies that are affected with electricity effects. You can easily combine these ability damage shards with multiple options from the Helminth system. Speaking about the Helminth abilities, in my testing I really liked Wisp's ability Breach Surge, for additional damage from the sparks and for proccing radiation on enemies. You can also consider Citrine's Fractured Blast if you're struggling with your energy economy, and if you want to become an invisible sentry gun, you can use Ivara's Quiver with cloak arrows. For additional damage on your Void replicas from Grasp of Lohk, you can consider running Rhino's Roar, Equinox's Rest and Rage, or Caliban's Sentient Wrath, providing ability damage and damage for an ability respectively. Nourish is as always a solid choice as it will actually apply to accused targets, which cause massive spreading of viral procs. But in my opinion, the most fun and broken choices for me were Decoy from Loki paired with the Damage Decoy augment, and Tempest Barrage from Hydroid with the augment Viral Tempest, which you will have been seeing gameplay of throughout the video. But more on these builds in a little bit, because first I want to talk about companions. In general, I think the best companion to run is either Xaku Prime or the Kubro, at least when you are building for the Grasp of Lohk ability. This is because these companions can provide you with a source of invisibility that will not break as long as you only cast abilities and do nothing else, which, if you are using Grasp of Lohk, is exactly what you are doing. The choice between the Kubro and the Xaku Prime is then made based on whether you want to run any of the new Retriever mods for additional loot, or if you like the survivability that a Sentinel can provide. For the Kubro, I used the following build in all scenarios for additional loot, and for the Xaku Prime, I used this build which focused more on quick respawn times and survivability for Xaku. Outside of this, the other companion I would recommend is the Panzervulpaphyla for passive viral spreading, increasing your overall damage, and you can get some additional armor stripping through the use of Vicious Bond. This then brings me to the weapons you can consider using on Xaku. For primaries, there's not any super duper best in slot weapon. Anything that works well with Xata's Whisper, or that's able to deal some crazy blast damage, like the Sybaris Prime, can work great. If you want to go more towards the utility side of things on your primary, I can recommend using the Dread with the new Unseen Dread augment, which I enjoyed using to remain invisible for the odd time that I broke invisibility from my companion. For the secondary, there's in my opinion only one choice, and that's the Grimoire. The amount of utility benefits that Grimoire offers is unparalleled and can solve many issues. Need more ability strength? Use the Grimoire. Need more ability duration? Use the Grimoire. Struggling with energy? Use the Grimoire. What's even crazier is that the Grimoire is able to recharge its alternate fire mode from Xaku's guns, which means that you can continuously spam the alternate fire everywhere. For my own build, I used a tow mod that gives me additional energy regen, just to make sure that I was able to always keep up the fast Untime while playing. Your melee weapon is again, in my opinion, best used as a utility tool. I used the Praedos for additional parkour velocity and sprint speed, which just helped me get around the map more quickly to rain down fire on as many unfortunate enemies as possible. Finally, let's talk about some of the Arcanes. From my testing, I found that a lot of the Arcanes actually not really benefit Xaku, except for Molt Augmented and Molt Efficiency. I also tried using Arcane Ice Storm to further min-max strength and duration, but this was honestly too much of a hassle to keep up or build up before casting my abilities. So in my view, the best choices of Arcanes are Molt Augmented and Molt Efficiency, or if you really need the extra energy, you can replace Molt Efficiency with Arcane Energize. So then for the builds you all have been waiting for. As I said, I played around with many builds, but I will limit the ones that I show in this video to 4 builds in total. One will be focused on movability and massive damage, the other one will be focused more on camping in a single room, and the other 2 builds will feature one more beginner friendly build and one speedrun build for relics, as well as syndicate medallions. I will start off with the beginner friendly build, which uses not too many expensive mods and keeps all of Xaku's original abilities. Here I did use Molt Augmented and Molt Efficiency, as these arcanes are relatively cheap and easy to come by these days. But they are not needed at all for this build to function, so don't worry if you don't have them. In the beginner build, the focus lies on a good distribution across all of the ability modifiers, with the main focus being on range, as this modifier will overall be the biggest boon to Xaku. When you are playing, focus on keeping up your ability timers by refreshing the fast untime and profit from easy auto-aim damage to enemies. Then for the speedrunning build, this is not too different from the basic build. Instead, I used preparation to start off with a lot of energy on spawn, and I used fractured blast to keep up the energy throughout the mission. This build will do more than enough damage for normal star chart relics and for hunting syndicate medallions. And this then brings me to the build which for me felt the smoothest and most powerful to play. In this build I used the earlier mentioned Tempest Barrage together with Viral Tempest to massively increase the damage on my Void guns from Grasp of Lohk. This made it way easier to scale damage in the beginning stages of long missions, and Tempest Barrage can easily be spammed while moving around, and also puts enemies into a full stun lock when you combine it with the slow effect from the fast untime. It also helped loads in dealing with acolytes almost instantly, which is great because violence is Xaku's biggest threat. For the build I used the following, focusing on a healthy amount of power strength, massive range and some duration. I want to note that the Viral Tempest augment increases the viral status chance based on ability strength, which practically causes enemies caught in your barrage to immediately have the maximum 10 viral stacks applied, increasing your damage by a whopping 325% as a final multiplier. Furthermore, the corrosive status from Tempest Barrage is super handy when you have to leave to a new part of the map where you did not yet set up a gaze target for AoE armor strip, as armor will be reduced and damage will be massively increased from the corrosive procs, especially towards Levelcap. For the Archon Shards, I made sure to slot 4 Tau Emerald Archon Shards, increasing my ability damage on enemies affected by corrosive procs, which massively helped increase my damage against normal enemies, but also against acolytes as I mentioned before. This build was an absolute breeze to play, and I easily took it all the way to level cap in Void Cascade. Then for the final and more memey build, which is still insanely good, this build uses Decoy in combination with the Damage Decoy Augment. Damage Decoy will reflect enemy damage dealt to it, which is then increased by 350%, and this percentage then scales with ability strength on your build. Damage Decoy will also proc 5 random status effects, which are then able to deal damage over time. Now, normally casting this on another enemy or by just spawning your decoy in general, your decoy will almost instantly be killed. But here's the kicker. You can actually cast damage decoy on an enemy that's affected by gaze, which creates an invulnerable decoy that can continuously reflect enemy damage as long as gaze is active. Combine this with the fast untime and you can just sit back and watch enemies continuously kill themselves. And remember, you can always drag around gazed enemies with Magus Anomaly if their placement isn't to your liking. This strategy becomes crazy effective on higher levels, where enemies will be dealing millions of damage to themselves, followed by status procs going into the several 100,000. For the build, it looks like this, where I still build for a high amount of ability strength and ability range, as decoy benefits from both. And I of course use the damage decoy augment, which is 100% necessary for this to work. I used this build to go 4 hours in a solo circular survival quite easily, so I can say that it definitely worked. Then finally I want to close out again with Spectre considerations for Xaku. You can always consider running a Dante Spectre if you're experiencing difficulties with staying alive, but for Xaku, a Nidus Spectre is a really good consideration as well, as Nidus will give you a final 28% multiplier to your ability strength value, which applies even after the buffs from, for instance, Void Relics, making your abilities deal some unholy amounts of damage. And that then brings me to the end of this guide. If I've missed anything, let me know in the comments below the like and subscribe button, and let me know what you think about Xaku Prime. Finally, make sure to stay tuned for the build guides that I have coming up on the Trumna and the Quassus Prime, which are coming very soon. Bye. As always, thanks to all channel members for supporting the channel. If you are looking to become a member, please find the join button below the video.